Okay, this is awesome. I put this together because I know you're dealing with dyslexia, and all of a sudden I put another reading assignment in front of you, and that wasn't all that fair today. So what I want to do is read through a bunch of notes here for the Tutsi and Hutu um, uh, confrontation that happened in 1994. This is the Rwandan genocide that actually parallels the Holocaust of World War II, instigated by the Germans against the Jews and other minority groups. So I'm going to just read about the notes that I'm going to give the rest of the class to read through, but I thought you might find it easier to listen to me as I read through them, and you can follow along and find the answers for the graphic organizer. Um, Beginning in April 6, 1994, so not too long ago, 1994, the Hutus began slaughtering the Tutsis. These are the two peoples that were living in Rwanda at the time, in the African country of Rwanda. As the brutal killings continued, the world stood idly by, just watching it happen, watched the slaughter, which lasted 100 days. The Rwandan genocide left approximately 800,000 Tutsis and Hutu sympathizers dead. But who are the Hutu and Tutsis? The Hutu and Tutsis are two peoples who share a common past. When Rwanda was first settled, the people who lived there raised cattle. Soon the people who owned the most cattle were called Tutsis, and everyone else was just called Hutu. At this time, a person could easily change categories. They could go from Tutsi to Hutu, or Hutu to Tutsi, by either acquiring cattle, buying cattle, or through marriage. So they weren't as solidified as two separate peoples up until just recently. It wasn't until the Europeans came, of course, send us Europeans in, and we screw things up quite well, to colonize the area that the terms Tutsi and Hutu took on a racial role. So it was when the Europeans came that the Tutsis and Hutus became two separate peoples that were identified and gelled as two separate groups. The Germans, of course, were the first to colonize Rwanda in 1894, and they looked at the Rwandan people and thought, now catch this, when the Germans came, when they saw the Tutsis, they looked at them and saw that they had more European characteristics. So they were taller, they were lighter skinned, and they kind of looked more like Europeans. So of course, being good Germans, they thought, of course, that they would be better people or better suited for leadership because they looked more like Europeans. And so the Germans put the Tutsis in roles of responsibility. When the Germans lost their colonies after the Versailles Treaty declared this after World War I, Belgium took over. And in 1933, the Belgians solidified the categories of Tutsi and Hutu by making it that every person was to have an identity card. See, they carried around an identity card that labeled them either Tutsi, Hutu, or another minority group called Twa. And the Twa were a very small group of hunter-gatherers who also lived in Rwanda, but don't play as large of a role in the Rwandan massacre that was to happen in the 90s. Now, although the Tutsi constituted about 10% of Rwandan's population, and Hutu represented 90% of the population, the Belgians gave the Tutsi all the leadership positions. And of course, how do you think this made the Hutu feel? How do you think it made them feel? A little bit resentful. So the tensions began to rise when 10% of the population ruled 90% of the population just because they looked different. They looked more European, and they were considered to be more leadership quality just because of the way they looked. When Rwanda struggled for independence from Belgium later on, the Belgians switched the status of the two groups. Because they were facing a revolution instigated by the Hutu, the Belgians let the Hutus, who constituted the majority of Rwanda's population, to be in charge of the new government. So essentially what that means, when Belgium realized there was going to be a revolution, they switched roles. So they said, okay, we'll let the Hutus rule. And the Tutsis were then taken out of leadership, and of course they resented that, and so the tensions between the two peoples, again, went higher. Uh, the animosity between the two groups continued for decades into the 40s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. The tension between the two groups because of the way they were being manipulated by Europeans mounted. Now, on April 6, 1994, the president of Rwanda at the time was returning from a summit, a meeting in Tanzania, and he was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, which shot his plane out of the sky over Rwanda, um, Rwanda's capital city of Kigali. So Kigali is the capital city of Rwanda, and that his plane was shot down, and all on board were killed in the crash. You could imagine being shot down by a surface-to-air missile. Since 1973, this president had run a totalitarian regime in Rwanda. He was a Hutu. And totalitarian means he ruled with an iron fist. What he said went. There wasn't a lot of negotiations or debate. Whatever he wanted happened. That's a totalitarian situation. And I lost my place. That changed in 1993 when, before he was shot down in 1994, he signed an agreement which weakened the Hutu hold on Rwanda. So again, it was shifting the weight away from Hutus back to the Tutsis. Now, of course, this shifting of power from one peoples to another peoples is just going to raise the tensions between the two peoples even more. So the president, before he was shot down, had actually signed an agreement releasing some of the hold from the Hutus back to the Tutsis. And so then a year later, he gets shot down. Although it was never determined who was truly responsible for the surface-to-air missile, for this assassination, Hutu extremists, meaning these Hutus being extremists, felt very much that they should be in control. They didn't like the Tutsis. They thought they should be gone, shouldn't be in leadership. And these were extremists. They would do extreme things to make sure they were in power. Hutu extremists profited the most from the president's death. And within 24 hours after the crash, the Hutu extremists had taken over the government, blaming the Tutsis for the assassination, and began to slaughter the Tutsis. So the 100 days of slaughter begins. The killings began in Rwanda's capital city of Kigali. The Interahamwe, and you'll see that word, Interahamwe, on your graphic organizer. It's spelled Interahamwe, which means those who strike as one, Interahamwe, an anti-Tutsi youth organization established by the Hutu extremists, set up roadblocks, and they checked the identification cards and killed anybody who was carrying a Tutsi identification card. So they would set up these roadblocks, check the identification cards. If you were carrying one that said Tutsi, you'd be gone. You were actually assassinated. Most of the killing was done with machetes, clubs, knives, and over the next few days and weeks, roadblocks were set up all around Rwanda to do this very thing, to isolate the Tutsis and to assassinate them either with the machetes or clubs or knives, whatever they could get their hands on. On April 7th, the Hutu extremists began purging the government of their political opponents, which meant both Tutsis and Hutu moderates were killed. So it didn't just stop by killing Tutsis. These extremists were even killing their own Hutus who were moderates, which meant that these moderates really didn't want any violence. They just wanted to live and keep their families and feed their families and work day to day. But they were moderates. They were not extremists. And so the Hutu extremists would even kill these Hutu moderates because they were not, following the revolution kind of thing. So that's what happened there. Over the next several days and weeks, the violence continued to spread, and since the government had the names and addresses of nearly all the Tutsis living in Rwanda, remember, because the identity cards, and if you carried an identity card, there would be a file in the government files saying who you were, whether you were Hutu or Tutsi, and since that was happening, they could know exactly who lived where and which ones. They would go from door to door to door, massacring Tutsis and Hutu moderates. Men, women, and children were murdered. And since the Hutus had the names, they could go door to door and do this. Since bullets were expensive, most Tutsis were killed by hand weapons, like I mentioned, machetes or clubs and knives. and many were often tortured before being killed. Some of the victims were even given the option of... Oh, are we still recording? Yep, I think we are. Yes, we're still recording. Actually, the screen went blank. Sorry about that. Also, during the violence, thousands of Tutsi women were raped, and some were raped and then killed. Others were kept as sex slaves for weeks, and some Tutsi women and girls were also tortured before being killed, such as having their breasts cut off or had sharp objects shoved in them. Thousands of Tutsis tried to escape the slaughter by hiding in churches, hospitals, schools, and government offices, and these places, which historically have been places of refuge, were turned into places of mass murder during the Rwandan genocide. One of the worst massacres of this genocide took place on April 15th and 16th, 1994, at the Nyarubuye Roman Catholic Church, located about 60 miles east of Kigali. Here, the mayor of the town, who was a Hutu, encouraged Tutsis to seek sanctuary inside the church and assured them that they would be safe. And then the mayor betrayed them to the Hutu extremists. The killing began with grenades and guns, but soon changed back again to machetes and clubs. Killing by hand was tiresome, so the killers took shifts, and it took 2 days to kill the thousands of Tutsis who were inside the church. Similar massacres took place all around Rwanda, with many of the worst ones occurring between April 11th and the beginning of May. To further degrade the Tutsis, Hutu extremists would not allow the Tutsi dead to be buried. Their bodies were left where they were slaughtered, exposed to the elements, eaten by rats and dogs. Many Tutsi bodies were thrown into rivers, lakes, and streams in order to send the Tutsis back to Ethiopia, a reference to a myth that the Tutsis were foreigners and originally came from Ethiopia. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about the propaganda. The Hutus on the radio would talk about these myths about that the Tutsis were really not from Rwanda, they were Ethiopian, they didn't belong here, they should go home where they came from. And again, this propaganda was spoken over the radio waves and over the media as a way of convincing the main people to participate in this revolution against the Tutsis and the Hutu moderates. For years, the Kangura newspaper, controlled by the Hutu extremists, had been spouting hate. As early as 1990, that newspaper, the Ten Commandments for the Hutu, the commandments declared that any Hutu who married a Tutsi was a traitor. Also, any Hutu who did business with a Tutsi was a traitor. So again, that was more of the propaganda that was going on. The commandments also insisted that all strategic positions and the entire military must be Hutu. In order to isolate the Tutsis even further, the commandments also told the Hutu to stand by other Hutu and to stop pitying the Tutsis. So there was even peer pressure put on by the Hutus to not go around the Tutsis while they're being killed and don't show them any mercy or pity. Radio broadcast in 1993 also spread hate. It packaged an appeal to the masses by offering popular music and broadcasts conducted in a very informal conversational tones. And when the killings started, they actually espoused this hate over the radio as well. This radio station called for the Tutsis to cut down the tall trees, a code phrase which meant for the Hutu to start killing the Tutsi. So that little code phrase, start cutting down the trees, was a signal broadcast over the radio as propaganda to start the killing spree. And that's again how propaganda was used. Meanwhile, what was everybody else doing in 1994 when this was going on? What was the rest of the world doing? Well, the United Nations adopted a resolution in 1948, 10 decades before, which stated that contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. And you'd think, according to this mandate that they passed back in 1948, that this massacre would fall under this jurisdiction and they would not allow it. The United Nations would not allow it. Clearly, the massacres in Rwanda constituted genocide, so why didn't the United Nations step in? There's been a lot of research on this exact question. Some people have said that since the Hutu moderates were killed in the early stages, then some countries believe the conflict to be more of a civil war. and not really against the Hutus against the Tutsis, since some of the Hutu moderates were being killed at the same time. No matter what the reason, the world should have stepped in, but we didn't. The world stood by while 800,000 people were wiped out in this genocide. The Rwandan genocide ended only when the RPF took over the country, which basically is the Rwandan Patriotic Front. These were trained military group consisted of Tutsis who had been exiled in earlier years, many of whom lived in Uganda. They were able to enter Rwanda and slowly take over the country, and in mid-July 1994, when the RPF had full control, only then did the genocide stop. So, Lawson, you can go over this a little bit, re-listen to it, look at the graphic organizer, and fill in those boxes. I think I've given you a lot to work with there. If there's anything, any boxes that you don't understand, just call me over and we'll talk more about it. And again, I'll try to do the same thing with the Holocaust information too that we looked at today. And sorry I didn't have anything for you. I didn't know I was coming in Monday until late Sunday night for sure. So anyway, let's work together on it. I hope this helps you out. Let me know.